Hello everyone and welcome. My name is J.P. Michaud. I'm Professor of Entomology at K-State and the Entomology Specialist for Western Kansas. This presentation is going to provide an update on current developments in the pest problems affecting agriculture in our region. Today I'm going to address several topics of current importance to pest management in Kansas. Several of these are directly related to climate change, so I'm going to review some ways that global warming can be expected to change our pest problems. Sorghum midge is not something we used to worry about in Kansas, as it rarely caused problems this far north, but that appears to be changing. Most of you are likely aware of the area-wide problems we had with fall armyworm populations last fall, that in many cases got started on volunteer wheat and then moved into early planted fields. I will discuss the probable cause of this phenomenon. Chinch bugs are a problem that historically affected sorghum in eastern parts of the state, but problems in the west have become more common and management options for this pest are limited. I also want to discuss the current status of sugarcane aphid and why it has now been reduced to the status of an endemic pest. Finally, I will discuss reasons why the blanket application of neonicotinoid seed treatments to virtually all the seed sold by commercial suppliers might be a cause for concern. The nature of our pest problems is changing, even though the same species are involved. So if we want to be prepared for the future, we need to understand the forces driving these changes. And the most important is climate change. We know we're heating up the planet, but that does not mean everywhere is getting hotter, and local short-term consequences remain unknown. One thing is certain: weather conditions will become more unpredictable. But there is data that can help us see where we're headed in general. For example, over the past 30 years, the western half of the country has gotten drier, while the eastern half has gotten wetter. And this has driven more drought out west and flooding in the east. And of course, we're right in the middle. And over the past 5 years, the weather has definitely been wetter and cooler than normal in Kansas, as this map would suggest. But we cannot count on this trend to continue. Weak La Nina conditions are driving these conditions and have persisted for the past 20 years, but they will not persist forever. Weather anomalies are likely to become more frequent, and normal weather will become a thing of the past. And if we do return to a period of heat and drought, the odds are it will be hotter and drier than ever. So let's look at the primary driver of our weather anomalies: destabilization of the jet stream. The jet stream is the high-altitude flow of winds that drives all our weather systems at lower altitudes, and its pattern is changing. The jet stream itself is becoming less stable, so the amplitude of the waveform is becoming more pronounced, as depicted in the lower panel relative to the upper one. Consequently, the jet stream is now failing to reliably confine all the cold air around the Arctic Circle as it once did, which accounts for severe cold snaps like the one in February of 2021 that reached down into South Texas. Increased temperatures in the tropics are also creating higher air pressure around the equator, and this is slowly pushing the entire jet stream flow northward. And these changes mean that in the summer, migratory pests will be able to ride seasonal southerly winds further north and could arrive earlier than they have in the past. Remember, at least half of our major pests do not overwinter in Kansas, but migrate north from southern latitudes every summer. The second big effect on agriculture will be the possibility for additional generations of short-lived pests that have many generations per year. A perfect example of such a pest is the sorghum midge, which can have more than 20 generations in a season in the southern high plains. And the more generations per year are possible, the further north it can increase its range and the greater the possibility of very large populations late in the season. Now, sorghum midge is a tiny fly that lays its eggs in the individual florets of sorghum panicles. The larvae then consume the developing ovary, producing an empty seed capsule. The damage you see in the central panel on the left is typical of sorghum midge, where you end up with a few filled kernels up and down the length of the panicle, surrounded by blasted seed capsules. However, damage may also be concentrated at the top or bottom of the panicle, depending on the timing of attack. And this pattern of damage symptoms can be difficult to distinguish from that caused by lygus bugs when they attack the grain at milk stage. Adult midges live only 1 or 2 days, but the life cycle can be completed in 2 weeks in warm weather, creating the potential for many generations to occur in a single growing season. And this can lead to very large populations late in the season when the earlier generations have good survival. Problems begin well to the south of us, where the midge overwinters as diapausing larvae in unharvested panicles and completes its first 2 generations in Johnson grass. This is long before the first sorghum flowers become available. Now, control of Johnson grass early in the season would in theory help reduce the numbers of midge entering sorghum fields. But there is just too much Johnson grass in roadsides and unmanaged areas for this to be an effective control tactic. Now, an interesting aspect of midge biology is that females produce unisexual broods, either all sons or all daughters. Infested seed capsules will exude a bright orange juice when squeezed. To control midge, an insecticide treatment must be carefully timed to target adults before they lay their eggs, because all subsequent life stages are protected within the seed capsule. A broader concern for pest management in sorghum is that all materials registered for midge control are broad-spectrum contact insecticides. So even though the midges themselves are easy to kill with a well-timed spray, there's always a risk of harming beneficial insects and disrupting biological control of other pests, such as aphids. In order to have any chance of preventing damage, fields must be scouted right as they start flowering. And this is done by banging heads into a white bucket, just as you would do in sampling for headworms. And the threshold is only 1 midge per panicle. You will need to sample at least 10 heads in each of 5 different locations in the field, because infestations are often patchy. The adults are harder to see than headworms too, because they're much smaller and the same color as the anthers, which are going to fill up your bucket. Now, damage by lygus bugs can easily be mistaken for midge damage, but it is caused by migrating adult bugs, and it is usually confined to a uniform band around the panicle where milk stage grain was concentrated during the attack. Alfalfa fields can be an important source of lygus bugs at this time of year, so be aware of adjacent alfalfa fields and avoid mowing them while nearby sorghum is flowering, because you will trigger a mass migration. Now, heat stress and bird damage are other types of seed loss you might mistake for midge damage. Again, empty but otherwise undamaged seed capsules are diagnostic, typically with some of the grain filled and distributed up and down the head. Now, if you were working in agricultural extension last fall, you would have had more than a few calls about fall armyworms, either on volunteer wheat or on early planted wheat fields. It is important to note that this outbreak was not a localized phenomenon. The fact that the entire Central Plains were affected, including turf farms in Missouri, tells us that this was most likely caused by area-wide weather conditions. Specifically, the cold spring weather that delayed the initial moth migration from the south. Now, fall armyworms come in many different colors, so here are the 2 most reliable diagnostic features. The The widest stripe on the side of the caterpillar is very dark, and there is a yellow Y on the head capsule. Now, the fall armyworm completes 2 generations in Kansas, beginning when migrant moths lay eggs on corn and sorghum in whorl stage. This damage makes the plant look ragged, but it won't affect yield, except in the few cases when the meristem of the plant is killed within the whorl. It is the second generation we need to worry about because these larvae will feed in the heads, right up until the hard dough stage, and can reduce yield significantly. However, you will recall we did not have headworm problems in sorghum last year. And this is most likely because of the cold spring weather again, that delayed all insect development by 6 weeks or more. This made the second generation much too late to feed in sorghum heads, so the moths laid their eggs in seedling wheat and cool season grasses instead. That was all there was. So here's an example of anomalous weather conditions shifting the entire cycle of a pest population relative to the phenology of its normal host plants. In this case, the new wheat crop paid a price for what benefited the maturing sorghum. There are many treatment options for headworms in grain sorghum. The most popular seem to be generic combinations of pyrethroids and organophosphates that are often promoted by applicators because they are inexpensive. I do not recommend these for several reasons. They are not selective for beneficial species, and there are more effective alternatives, and these don't even provide reliable control anymore. Both corn earworms and fall armyworms have a long history of exposure to these modes of action on the very many different crops they infest, and many populations express high levels of resistance to these older generic materials. If a rescue treatment is required, the preferred materials are those containing either spinosad or chlorantraniliprole as the active ingredient. The common trade names are Blackhawk and Prevathon. These are more selective for beneficial species, primarily because they must be consumed in order to have toxicity. In the case of Prevathon, you also have some absorption by the plant, which improves residual efficacy. However, the 2 products shown here are even more selective for beneficial insects because they are viral diseases specific to only one species of insect, either corn earworms or fall armyworms. They don't kill anything else, and they're quite inexpensive. But because they are biological products, they cannot be used like conventional insecticides. They are best used more as an insurance policy than as a rescue treatment. You are essentially seeding a disease epidemic in your field. Consumption of the virus by the caterpillar is key, and this is enhanced by the formulation. Even though larvae take a few days to die, they stop feeding shortly after infection, which prevents most yield loss. They also tend to die high up on the very tops of the heads, which enhances further spread of the virus and also makes it easy to verify treatment efficacy. These products have been used in grain sorghum and other crops, including soybeans, for several years now with very good results. But they have to be applied early in the flowering cycle to infect the very first larvae to hatch. As these larvae die, they serve as sources of secondary infection, and other insects help move the disease through the field so you never have to reapply. There is also no need to scout fields, and you won't have to worry about disrupting biocontrol or flaring aphids. Historically, chinch bugs were mostly a problem in the eastern part of the state. However, damage by both first and second generation chinch bugs is becoming more common further west. The nature of the damage by the 2 generations is very different because different stages of the crop are attacked. Large numbers of first generation nymphs hatch and begin feeding in wheat, but cannot complete development before the wheat matures, so they march across the ground and can kill row after row of seedling sorghum in adjacent fields. Using a seed treatment on wheat to be planted next to sorghum can help protect it. Using a seed treatment on sorghum planted next to wheat can help protect it. But we want to avoid seed treatments on wheat as much as possible for reasons I'll come back to shortly. Fortunately, the only materials registered for chinch bug control are broad-spectrum contact insecticides, once again. And it is hard to get contact with these bugs because they're always hiding in concealed locations on the plant. When first-generation bugs mature, the adults can fly off and lay eggs in wild summer grasses. However, over the last 10 years or so, more and more of them are returning to sorghum fields to lay eggs in the emerging panicles. You will probably recognize these red chlorotic lesions resulting from chinch bugs feeding behind leaf sheaths, as this damage has become increasingly common, especially along the borders of fields. And this is not likely to affect yield, but if eggs are laid in the panicles at boot stage, the panicle will fail to emerge properly and become fouled with mold, as you can see here. Unfortunately, control of second-generation chinch bugs is even more difficult, as they have many more hiding places on larger plants. This makes second-generation bugs extremely difficult to scout, so no treatment thresholds have ever been established, and there are no approved control measures for preventing this damage. A number of people have asked me what happened to the big populations of sugarcane aphid that we had 5 to 7 years ago. Well, our community of beneficial insects ate them all. They just needed a couple of years to adapt and learn how to exploit this aphid as a new food source. This illustrates the value of background biological control. And this was entirely predictable, because the same group of insects consistently provides control of a dozen different aphid species in our summer crops, including at least 5 or 6 aphid species in sorghum. Now, this process occurred quite quickly, probably because it was facilitated by 2 important contributing factors. The first was the availability of various sources of plant resistance in existing sorghum breeding lines. And this helped control source populations in southern latitudes where the aphid overwinters. The second was the availability of materials such as sulfoxaflor and flupyridifurone, sold as Transform and Savanto, and these could be used to suppress outbreak populations while being reasonably soft on the beneficials. Natural enemies were left impacted by these insecticides and quickly cleaned up any aphids that survived the applications. But it hasn't worked that way for sorghum farmers in Georgia and South Carolina. They just don't have the same numbers of lacewings, lady beetles, and all the other aphid predators that we have out here. And why not, you may ask? Well, the most obvious answer is they aren't surrounded by millions of acres of winter wheat, and that is where all our natural enemies multiply in spring before moving into our summer crops. So this is the normal pattern following invasion of a new aphid species. We have phased transitions from epidemic to attenuation to endemic, but the speed at which this process occurs depends a lot on our management responses. What took only 5 years with sugarcane aphid took almost 30 years for green bugs on the same crop, mostly because our efforts to protect yield with broad-spectrum insecticides kept impeding the evolution of biological control. Which is not to say that we won't ever have outbreaks of sugarcane aphid in the future, but if we do, you can be sure they will have been caused by bad management decisions that disrupted biological control. And one of those bad management decisions that currently concerns me is the blanket treatment of all crop seed with neonicotinoid insecticides. Unfortunately, treatment of sorghum seed with Poncho and Cruiser was one of the responses of the seed companies to the sugarcane aphid invasion. This may have helped at the beginning when aphids were out of control, but now it is no longer needed, and yet it is now impossible to get untreated seed of most crops, not just sorghum. This concerns me because no one seems to be thinking through the longer-term consequences, especially the potential threat it poses to biological control services. So we can start with some simple common sense questions. Is it consistent with IBM principles? No. The fundamental principle of IPM is that insecticides should never be used without justification of need, based on the presence of economically damaging insect populations. Is it cost effective for the farmer? No. Studies have shown no consistent yield benefit in Kansas or any other state at this latitude. And yet farmers are now forced to pay an extra $8 to $10 per acre for something they don't even need, something that is poisoning their fields unnecessarily. Is it good for the environment? No, there are huge environmental ramifications, especially when one considers the toxicology of these materials and the vast acreages now involved. And because these are broad-spectrum neurotoxins, they are killing a lot more than just the pests. They are impacting soil health by killing decomposers responsible for nutrient recycling in both soil and water, and reducing the biomass of insects available to feed birds and fish. Is it compatible with biological control? No, because the negative impacts on natural enemies are both direct and indirect. They are not only poisoned via residues in plant exudates and nectar, but any survivors are starved out of our fields because there's nothing for them to eat. It doesn't even make sense from the perspective of conserving the utility of the insecticides themselves, because pests are eventually exposed to sublethal doses as concentrations decline in the plants, which is exactly how we would produce insecticide resistance in laboratory populations. We expose them to sublethal doses and then breed the survivors. So in a time when we are trying to renaturalize agriculture and encourage sustainable farming practices, elimination of seed treatments would seem to be pretty low-hanging fruit, especially when we're treating seeds of crops like sunflowers that would otherwise nourish our beneficial insects. Sunflowers, whether cultivated or wild, are one of the most important plants sustaining beneficial insects on the high plains. And this is because they're covered with tiny extrafloral nectaries that are important sources of water and nutrients, especially during hot, dry weather. But all the sunflower seed is now treated with systemic neonicotinoids, which our work has shown contaminates these important resources. And you can see the little beetle here feeding directly, and these wasps, etc., feeding directly from the surfaces of the plant. So now, instead of nourishing these beneficial species when we plant sunflowers, we're poisoning them. And how can these insects sustain their population in other summer crops when there's not a single insect alive on the plants for the first 2 months? Lately, many co-ops have been pushing farmers to treat their wheat seed. I was in western Kentucky last summer. Not a big wheat producer, obviously, but almost all their seed wheat is now being treated with thiamethoxam. Recall that wheat is where all our natural enemies have their first generation of the year and multiply their numbers before migrating to summer crops. So how can this be beneficial for biological control? Now, we might hope that most of the effect will wear off over the winter before the wheat is colonized by insects in the spring. But not much plant growth takes place over the winter, and some late planted fields might not even germinate until spring. So there's no guarantee that these plants will not pose a hazard to our first generation of natural enemies. This is something I'm exploring in a field study this year, because if we start growing wheat as a sterile crop, that could really spell the end of natural biological control in Kansas. So seed treatments might not have been a problem when they were used occasionally to protect a field here and there against the wireworm infestation. But we need to consider the large scales now involved and the large numbers of non-target species being affected. Do we really want to manage our croplands like golf courses? Green deserts devoid of all other life except the crop? Because insects are the foundation of entire ecosystems. And if our cultivated fields are not producing any insects, what are the birds going to eat? And these materials are quite mobile in groundwater, and they've been linked to delayed decomposition in streams and lakes and declining fish populations. They bind irreversibly to nicotinic receptors on nerve cell membranes, so organisms can eventually accumulate lethal doses over long periods, even when exposed to very low environmental concentrations. And we humans have nicotinic receptors in our nervous systems too, just not as many. So they're not entirely harmless to us either. And if we want to continue with a zero-tolerance approach towards insects, cultivating greed in deserts, when pests do break out, and they will, we can forget about biocontrol coming to our rescue. In closing, I have to wonder how farmers would respond if the federal government, say in the form of the USDA, came to them and said, "You are now going to have to pay extra to coat all your seed with toxic chemicals you don't really need and that cause a wide range of environmental impacts." How would they respond, I wonder? Because that is exactly what the seed corporations are doing. And unless farmers organize and demand access to untreated seed, we're headed towards ever greater input dependency in agriculture and further away from the sustainable models of agriculture we really need. So that's all for this year. Let's try and keep pest management as safe as we can for both farmers and the environment.